Dear students, teachers and guests, it's my great honor to welcome and introduce you the honorary professor of the National University of Kyiv-Mogil Academy, Девід Ріфф. Девід Rіфф, a graduate in history from Princeton University, is a New York-based journalist and writer. During the 1990s, he covered conflicts and wars in Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, Liberia, the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo, and Central Asia. He has published numerous articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Le Monde, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications. Девід Ріфф has also written extensively about Iraq and Latin America and is now covering the war in Ukraine, often traveling with pan-Ukraine aid missions to areas close to the front. He is the author of 8 books, including Slaughterhouse, Bosnia and the Failure of the West, and A Bed for the Night, Humanitarianism in Crisis. Rieff's latest book, The Praise of Forgetting, The Irony of Historical Memory, was published in 2016. He is also the author of Swimming in a Sea of Death, a son's-loving tribute to his mother, the writer Susan Sontag, and her final battle with cancer. He is also the editor of 2 volumes of Susan Sontag's journals and notebooks. The title of his inaugural lecture is The Moral Ambiguities of Historical Memory, Some Cultural Reflections of the Ukrainian Past, Present, and Possible Futures. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, for this great honor, and for being here. If we are interrupted by the air raid that is printed, my speech, so you can have a look at it that way. Before I begin, I want to dedicate this lecture to the memory of a young woman who was killed in Kharkiv about 30 hours ago, called Veronika Kosciuszko, and who was it was your age, the students here. She was 18 years old, and an incredibly talented young artist. So this is, in a sense, I had met her once in Kharkiv at an event, but anyway, the death of anyone is terrible. The death of someone of your age is even more terrible. President Kvit, НаУКМА faculty and staff, friends, distinguished guests, first-year students, and the loved ones of first-year students. I'm very, very grateful and touched by the honor this university does me today. Whether I'll ever be able to repay this debt of gratitude is something about which I'm anything but certain. I can only say that my intention is to interpret the honorary professorship that you're conferring upon me here as meaning that henceforth, whether I'm in Ukraine, as I fully intend to be at least part of the time, from today until such time as I'm under the ground rather than above it, or I'm abroad, I'm at your disposal in whatever ways that I can be useful to you, to this university, to this country. I'm certainly under no illusions about the importance of such an engagement, for much as Ukraine has come to mean to me since I first came here in April of 2022, I would willingly give up the privilege, and for me it's a great privilege, of coming here every couple of months if my absence, could be exchanged for a few more Atacams or an F-16. But since that's just magical thinking on my part, such a bargain is not one that anyone in Washington or Brussels or Berlin is going to make with me. Here I'll remain, doing my best to become a very modest part of the intellectual furniture of this very distinguished and old university, and by extension of the cultural and intellectual life of Ukraine during this terrible and heroic moment in its history. and also in the better days that hopefully will follow. I want, again, to pay tribute to the memory of Veronika Kosciuszko. She represents what's most terrible, I think, about the situation here. Your armed forces represents what's most heroic about the situation here. And I think all of you represent what I hope will be indeed better days. And those are the better days. You will be the authors, the creators of those better days. I want my remarks to be about Ukraine and not about me. Still, all of you are more than entitled to wonder what in God's name I'm doing here. After all, I'm a journalist and a writer, and even at its best and its most scrupulous, those two intertwined vocations are always morally ambiguous. To name only the most obvious of their moral hazards, how is one to know where moral commitments stop and where an immoral, or if you prefer, maybe more accurately, an amoral voyeurism begin? Ultimately, that question is an unanswerable one, and the best the writer can hope for is that what one tries to contribute outweighs whatever vanity or questionable motivations that may also be involved. And as I say, giving oneself and being accorded the benefit of the doubt on this requires a leap of faith for both the visitor, in this instance me, and the visited, which in this instance, of course, is you. In Kierkegaard's great phrase, life can only be understood retrospectively, but you've got to live it prospectively. But even then, I'm not sure that one can ever explain oneself to oneself, let alone to anyone else. In my own case, though actuarially speaking, I'm approaching the end of my life, I doubt I'll ever understand completely how and why I've lived it as I have. But if in fact there's been any intelligence involved at all in the design of that life, and I'm not sure there has been, to be honest, I think it's taken the form of what, if you'll forgive me for putting it this way, I'd call two moral bookends. I turned 40 in the fall of 1992, watching alongside other journalists the evacuations of Bosniak prisoners from Chernobyl, one of the archipelago of concentration camps the Serbs had established in northern Bosnia over the course of that summer. They were shutting them down. And I've passed much of my 70th and 71st years, and in a few weeks' time will mark my 72nd, in a second just war, your war, Ukraine. In between, that's what I meant by moral bookends. I've reported on many wars: Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, a fair number of others. In the end, I stopped. Old age caught up with me, and when I realized I could no longer run, I threw off the war correspondence profession for good, or at least I thought it was for good. And I was certainly right to do so. The last thing I want is for some 22-year-old to get shot in the lung because I'm too arthritic to climb out of a trench or run across a field. But if I'm being honest, while no one in his or her right mind is glad to grow old, I wasn't so sorry to stop being a war journalist. For none of the wars I reported on after Bosnia seemed morally clear in the way Bosnia had. Quite the contrary, each appeared to confirm the then humanitarian and, if you like, the human rights version of the world, understanding of the world. And by that I mean the conviction that none of these wars should have happened, that there was no just side, even if occasionally one could say that one party of the conflict was the lesser of evils, and that for the most part those responsible for these wars would, in a better world, have been thought of not as leaders, but as enemies of the human race. But then along came Ukraine, whose cause seemed to me, and seems to me, as clear-cut morally as Bosnia's had been. And because I believe that so completely, and I assure you that such belief does not come easily to me if I have an intellectual default position, an attitude toward the world, it's to see moral ambiguity in pretty much everything. But here I am back in the world of war, now taking a few risks with my very arthritic neck in Ukraine's cause and hoping that I'm more useful to you than I am a burden to you. It's no sacrifice, I assure you. Indeed, from a moral point of view, I've never had an easier assignment. And anyway, selfishly, there's no better feeling I know than doing what you're good at. So of course, obviously I'm too old for my life, but I've found this to make it all the more precious, and old age is here anyway, which means death's around the corner anyway, which means, why not? So when people in Ukraine say to me, as they often do, why do you come here? Why do you keep coming back? I come now every third or fourth month and have and will go on doing so. My answer is the same. It's a privilege. So that's really more than enough about me. Let me try to talk about things here and the questions that are important, I think, some of the questions that might be worth thinking about. George Orwell once wrote that every war, when it comes or before it comes, is represented not as a war, but as an act of self-defense against a homicidal maniac. And as a general historical rule, he was absolutely right. But just as I'm certain that he would have seen the cause of the Spanish Republic's, alas, unsuccessful resistance to Franco's fascism, the war in which he fought and in which he was very badly wounded, and the next war, the subsequent war, successful war, World War against Nazi Germany, I think he would have thought of those as exceptions to that general rule, just as I believe he would have, were he alive today, seen the Bosniaks' resistance to the Serbs between 1992 and 1995, and yours against the forces of the latest version of the Russian Empire, just as much as exceptions, moral special cases, and thus as much worth fighting as the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War in Europe had been. Because if you call Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Serbia during that period, or Vladimir Putin homicidal maniacs, that's not the propagandistic oversimplification that Orwell was warning against, but it's just a plain statement of fact. Now, to insist on that doesn't mean that either the Bosnians in the first part of the 1990s or you Ukrainians today are saints. War brutalizes everyone to some extent, and always and with no exceptions involves the slaughter of innocents. And just so we're clear, those innocents are never only on your own side, much as we might wish it were not so. But it is to say that in Ukraine today, as in Bosnia 32 years ago, one side is in the right and the other in the wrong, full stop. The corollary to this is that sometimes one's enemies simply are homicidal maniacs. Looking back at the concentration camps the Serbs had in northern Bosnia, or at the torture mills that the Russians have been so quick to establish and continue to maintain virtually in every part of Ukraine they occupy, if anything, homicidal maniac seems like an understatement. I've spoken of Bosnia as a just war, but when I first went there in the summer of '92, I didn't yet have the language to describe it in that way. To the contrary, I was completely ignorant of the place, so much so that my pitch letter to the New Yorker magazine, a weekly magazine in New York that I used to write for, is full of mistakes, verbal mistakes. But then again, I only thought I was going to stay for 3 weeks, and I stayed for 3 years. And if I remained, it was because, as I've said, I soon came to believe in the justice of the Bosnian cause. The morality of their resistance seemed as crystal clear. They, the Bosniaks, the victims, the Serbs, and more ambiguously, the Croats, the victimizers. But I didn't have the language with which to justify that belief in any intellectually or philosophically grounded and serious way. I had my indignation, my outrage, but in my view, and some of you won't agree with this, at least fundamentally emotional responses, however admirable they are, and they can be admirable, are often also untrustworthy, unsustainable, and fickle, unfaithful. I wish it weren't that way, but if half a lifetime spent bearing witness to other people's tragedies and trying to convey those tragedies to audiences living far away from them has taught me anything, It's that we human beings are not altruism machines. And alas, more often than not, our moral indignation comes with what might call an ethical sell-by date, a time when you can't, it's expired. That's what the great songwriter Leonard Cohen meant by his lyric, "I distrust my inner feelings come and go." But the truth doesn't come and go. Whatever the cultural relativists may say, anyone who talks about my truth rather than the truth is not in fact talking about the truth at all, but about their feelings. Of course, you can't fight a war without emotions. The flag, the national anthem, all of it. And that's entirely right. That's in no way a criticism on my part. But you cannot fight a just war, the existential war for your own survival as a nation, as a people, that you Ukrainians are fighting now, without the truth in all its adamantine rigor. In my own case, I only found a language that seemed to me set out what a just war was and what it was not, when in the mid-90s, 1990s, after the Bosnian War had come to its very unjust conclusion, I began to read Catholic just war theory. And for those of you who don't know it, in just war theory, I found, I didn't know it either before that, the most profound moral arguments for anyone who is not a sincere pacifist in defense of the belief that wars are sometimes necessary. Indeed, they're sometimes imperative. A philosophical aside, really, less for you, but for various of your professors in this room who otherwise will yell at me later. And one of them rightly raised this in commenting on a draft of this paper. You could say, why not talk about Christian just war theory? Because there's a hugely important Protestant tradition thinking about just wars that go back to the Dutch philosopher Hugo Grotius in the early 17th century and the German legal philosopher von Pufendorf in the last part of the same century, of the 17th century, and continues today. In the 20th century, there was a key figure in thinking about just war as a Protestant theologian called Reinhold Niebuhr. And parenthetically, although Orthodoxy has its just war tradition, at least in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church, its subservience to the Russian state, that is to say, its elevation of the good of the state over everything else, which now includes the disgusting and all too widespread practices of blessing missiles and other weapons, sort of would seem to me to make a mockery of that Orthodox tradition. What makes Catholic just war theory more powerful to me, though, than the Protestant or indeed the secular tradition is that it's part of the catechism of the Catholic Church, quite simply. And it's morally authoritative and claims a moral authority and has a moral authority over all faithful Catholics. And that, I think, is a fundamental difference in our world. So, what is it? Well, simply put, Catholic just war theory, which comes first from the writings of both St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and continues in the 16th century through various Dominicans and Jesuits, it holds that for a war to be just, two principles must be fully met. The first is called jus ad bellum, and that means the war must have a just cause. It's the Latin for that. And the second is requirement jus in bello, demands justice in the means with which the war is fought. The second element, of course, as will be obvious to you, is the more important of the two in many ways. For it's pretty easy to think of wars that were fought in a just war, in a just cause, excuse me. But almost none of these were fought justly. And that means you have a very high threshold for what constitutes a just war in Catholic just war theory. For starters, really in practice, only defensive wars are justifiable. And don't underestimate the moral cost of that, because that pretty much means that, say, a war fought to abolish slavery in another country, even if it's waged with the noblest of intentions, might not fit the definition of a just war. There's also the obligation that all realistic peace efforts have been exhausted and that no outside power that is present that can protect a country from an aggression. In other words, war has to be the absolutely last recourse. And then, even if those conditions, and they're very stringent, very tough conditions, are met, a war's moral legitimacy depends on other stringent conditions. First, the damage inflicted, I'm quoting from the Catechism, inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. Second, that all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. And third, there must be a serious prospect of success. And finally, fourth, the use of arms must not produce evils or disorders greater than the evils to be eliminated. That final point is crucial, both in its moral vindication of certain wars and the stringent standards it sets for such vindication. For any moral justification of war that doesn't concede from the outset that war is evil is simply not worth taking seriously. I come back to what I said a couple of minutes ago about the slaughter of innocents, which is not possible. It's inevitable. So anyone who can accept that and say it's justified, that is justified to fight just the same, has to really meet these very strict conclusions. Those of us who are not pacifists, and I'm certainly not a pacifist, really have to, we have a moral obligation to justify any war we call a just war. So by that standard, very few qualify. An obvious example that you all know is the Gaza war. It's going on right now as we speak. You can make arguments in support of both sides, moral arguments about the justice of the cause, Israel, the Palestinians. But you can't make a serious case that either side is fighting the war justly. This war is one long set of war crimes. It's just, which war crime do you want to select of the many that you could choose? There is no way that you can talk about either side fighting a just war. You can talk in other terms about the disproportion of force, about the victims and victimizers, but victims, it's not that calling someone a victim is not the same thing as calling someone an innocent. Lots of today's victimizers were yesterday's victims. I saw that in Rwanda. And just war theory doesn't make the claim, the one I was talking about just now, about the need never to do evil things in war. Everybody understands that evil and disorder of war is what war is, part of what war is. But what just war theory does demand is that the evil not be greater than the evil being inflicted, or that you're resisting. And that's hard to determine. I think that's very obvious here, and I think it was very obvious in Bosnia, but it's not always obvious. The classic case is that of the decision by my own country in 1945 to drop 2 atomic bombs that obliterated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those who did justify it said, we'll do this, it'll bring the war to an end, and it'll save many more lives than it will extinguish. And those who opposed it say it created a greater evil than the one it sought to eliminate. So it's usually, if you're thinking about just wars, a judgment call. But you're an example of one that is not a judgment call. This is a just war. The only others in my very long life that I can think of were the independence of Bangladesh in 1970 and 1971, the military struggle of the African National Congress, very unsuccessful but entirely just against the apartheid regime in South Africa in the 1980s, and Bosnia and you. You if you just go down the list of the things that, the boxes you have to tick, if you like, the standards you have to meet, the requirements you have to meet, you fit all of them. The first, that the damage the invader seeks to cause is lasting, grave, and certain. Well, you know about that. The Russians deny even the existence of Ukraine as a nation. So-called Ukraine, as you know, is the way you're always referred to on Russian television. It doesn't exist as a culture. Ukrainian culture is viewed by Russians as part of the Russian world, a junior partner, very junior partner. And as an identity, there's that fellow Mardan, who's one of the worst of the television personalities on Russian TV, constantly calls you bewitched Russians. But the fact is that it would be nice if there were some way around fighting. It would be nice that my friends in the human rights world had been correct when they thought we were moving away from states and realpolitik and a new international order of rights. But as you Ukrainians know better than anyone, the international system, such as it is completely broken. All the ideas that inform the creation of the UN, which were about stopping exactly the kinds of wars that Russia is waging against you, well, that idea is in shambles. The UN specialized agencies, including in this country, do a lot of good work, but as a political institution, it's on its last legs, let's say, if it's not already been, it's a dead man walking, put it that way. The world you live in, the world Vladimir Putin wants to impose on you, is closer in outlook to the great statement of realpolitik that's in the Greek historian Thucydides' Melian dialogue. And there's a negotiation between this small island republic of Milos and the powerful Athenian army that's besieging it. And the Melians say, but what you're doing is unjust. And the Athenians reply, well, justice is only relevant between equal powers. Otherwise, they say, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And, that's Vladimir Putin's idea of the world, and maybe not only his. Another of Catholic just war theory's requirements that the damage done by the aggressor is lasting, grave, and certain. Well, you see that every day in Ukraine. The Russian way of war is quite simply to destroy everything in its past. That's what Putin's army did in Grozny, which led the UN, the poor UN, to designate the Chechen capital as the world's most destroyed city on Earth, the most destroyed city on Earth. That's what the Russians did in Aleppo in 2016, and of course it's what they did in Mariupol in 2022. And frankly, without sufficient air defenses and the dedication of those who operate them, I'm sure this city would have suffered the same fate. So that's what after all, that's what the people on RT, on Russian television, call for pretty much every night. And there's no reason not to take them at their word. A third requirement of Catholic just war theory is that all the other options of war have been tried and proven ineffective. And of course, as you all know, there are people in the West, and in other parts of the world as well, in the global South, who say Ukraine should have offered Russia more concessions in the run-up to the full-scale invasion. But basically, those concessions, even though these people who say things like that don't admit it, were basically recolonization by Russia, or more precisely, reabsorption into the Russian world. And, I always say to people who doubt this, they should read Putin's essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which he published in 2021, a year before, 8 months before the full-scale invasion. And he wrote that, Ukraine and Russia are essentially, all this, parts of the same historical and spiritual space. And your nationalism is nothing more than an effort to sow discord among people, dividing a single people against each other. And that's why those who think Ukraine should have been more conciliatory toward Russia are guilty of what, as you'll discover, those of you who take a philosophy class in your first year here at НаУКМА, is called a category mistake. And meaning that you're talking about, you're using a method of judging something inappropriate to the thing you're judging. Because the issue was never NATO expansion, let alone the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. It was Ukraine's right to exist, full stop. And your choice was to decide to exist or decide to assist your own suicide. That was it. Because for Putin, an independent Ukraine is an anti-Russian project, not just by realpolitik definition, but by, if you like, what he would call spiritual, and I would call ideological definition. So, you know, there's no validity to your national project, there's no validity to your cultural identity, your language is just a dialect of Russian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's true that between formal independence in '91 and the Revolution of Dignity, Russia was not completely, had not completely decided to destroy you. But that, I think, is because they assumed that your subservience sooner or later, despite some elections here, would be reestablished. And when they realized, I think, that that wasn't going to happen, that you really actually wanted to be Ukrainians and were determined to be Ukrainians and have a real country that would not be Belarus, to put it, that way. When you didn't bend, the full scale happened. So against this invasion, your resistance has been heroic. It's surprised the world. Maybe it's surprised you to some extent. But can it be sustained? I don't. I'm not able to know that. I don't even think any of us know that. We hope. But what we can say with absolute certainty is you could win. And so that final demand of Catholic just war theory, which is that victory is possible, and that's clearly met by your resistance. You've proved you can win if you get enough weapons. So again, if any war in our time can be called a just war, it's yours. And you're fighting against a people who want to exterminate you, but paradoxically also deny your existence. You know, in the Old Testament, the Hebrews decide to slaughter this rival people, the Amalekites. And they do so in the very gory way the Old Testament is full of. But they never said, that the Amalekites didn't exist. Just as the Athenians didn't tell the Melians in that dialogue that I referred to earlier. They didn't say, you're just bewitched, you're not Melians, you're just bewitched Athenians. So now, unfortunately, the bad news is that just as your resistance, your struggle seems to be validating Catholic just war theory, some Catholics, certainly several popes, including the present one, are pulling away from it. This began as early as the 1940s in a reaction to nuclear war, where Pius XII, the Pope at the time, thought that nuclear war just changed the nature of war, and you could no longer think about war in the same way, and therefore just war theory was outdated, in a sense, tragically outdated. But of course, because, the short version of that, it'll be obvious to you, is that any real nuclear war will mean the destruction of everybody. And so can you call that a war and talk about just war in that context? Right. Unfortunately, like many things in the Catholic Church, everything's gotten a lot worse with this Pope Francis, who has said such things as, we may be obliged to suffer injustice. We can't think of war as a solution. Then one of his speeches says, never again war. Now, people like me think that Francis is simply pro-Russian, and that's largely a function of he's an Argentine leftist, and in Argentina, on the Argentine left, as in most of the Latin American left, the United States is seen as a much greater evil than Russia. You could even say Russia is liked in that cynical sense of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So my own view is that one should not trust him in any case because of these political biases. Also because, of course, the Catholic Church has always had a fantasy of reunion with the Moscow Patriarchate, and that no pope is completely immune to that. And of course, in order to do that, you have to be friendly to the Moscow Patriarchate, which in effect, since the Moscow Patriarchate is for all intents and purposes a subset of the FSB, that means you have to be friendly with Putin. But as for never again war, well, you know, that's just not happening. War is back. The era of long before you were born, when your parents were young, after the end of the Cold War, there was the idea that war was going to start diminishing. And in fact, that hasn't happened. To the contrary, in not just here, but in Sudan, in Gaza, in Myanmar, and many other places, it's the reverse of the biblical injunction to beat swords into plowshares, to beat weapons into farm equipment. To the contrary, plowshares are being beaten into swords at Mach 2. So I don't, my own view, for what it's worth, is that this never again war is either hot air or pro-Russian sentiment, given some moral clothing to wear. So for Ukraine, because for Ukraine to exist, it has to resist. Now, self-evidently, the most important part of your resistance is military. Second most important is economic. But there's also cultural resistance, and it's on this topic, on the related one of what, for lack of a better term, we call collective memory, that I'd like to talk for a bit. By culture, I don't just mean the arts, although the fact that writing, music, and the visual arts are flourishing in Ukraine at this moment seems to me an extraordinary emblem both of your resistance and the vitality of the culture the Russians keep telling the world doesn't exist. I've had the privilege, thanks to two of your professors, Volodya Yermolenko and Tetiana Ogarkova, to spend a fair bit of time in different parts of this country. And it's amazing. Wherever you go, there's something that's really interesting, really alive. That's not true in plenty of important countries where there's no war, I have to tell you. So, you're being threatened with extinction, and you're having this cultural renaissance, from pop music to, high art, from serious novels to manga. It doesn't really, you see stuff pretty much everywhere that really would impress anybody, no matter how demanding. But there's, of course, other cultural aspects, challenges, if you like. The first is language, both in the forward-looking sense of what, if any, future Russian will have in this country, and in the rearward-looking sense of what role, and here I emphasize, if any, Russian culture can, or to put it more polemically, should have in post-war Ukraine. The second's the one I referred to earlier. That's memory. Not just how to remember the past, but whatever consensus you Ukrainians, and this will be made by your professors in the short run, this consensus, but if you don't accept it, it won't last. You're the people, the young people in this room, who will finally determine what kind of remembrance is the way people want to remember, people remember officially in Ukraine, what risks and what the risks are, because there are risks. Those risks are not inconsequential. It's an article of faith that it's always good to remember, and it's always a moral error to forget the past. And you know why this is true, because to deny the horrors of the past is in a certain way to give a posthumous victory to those who are responsible for those atrocities, and to inflict one more wound on the victims. The denial of the Holodomor is the paradigmatic example of this, and no one but a Soviet nostalgic could pretend otherwise. Fortunately, such people have largely disappeared from this country, although a number of them, one of whom used to teach at this university, unfortunately, these people are still influential in certain academic circles in the West, in Germany in particular. But what complicates memory, political memory, collective memory, how you as Ukrainians, not as individuals, but as Ukrainians, as a collectivity, remember your past, is that creating a national consciousness is not just acknowledging a nation's tragedy, the Holodomor, it's also creating a national myth. And national myths are always complicated. Myths are not history, much as we might wish it otherwise, nor collective memories, by which I refer not to people's individual contemporaneous memories, but the collective memories handed down and as such inevitably altered over the course of time from generation that experienced them to the generations that didn't. In his history of Ukraine, your great historian, Yaroslav Hrytsak, argues that the cumulative image of Ukraine from folk songs provides the foundations of the Ukrainian national myth. To be clear, Hrytsak is certainly not denouncing such myth-making. Myths don't mean a lie or a deliberate distortion, he writes. But he goes on to insist that as with any historical myth, we can't demand historical accuracy from the folk myth of Cossack Ukraine. A German historian put it in the same vein, a little bit more generally. Hans Werner Müller wrote, historians can't discount memory, but they can't count on it either. So the historian's task in principle, in normal times, if you like, is what the great Irish historian of the Irish famine, who's also written about the Holodomor, Cormac O'Grada, defined as historians have to be, above all, their job is to establish what happened in the past as best we can, no matter how inconvenient that may be for the present. But O'Grada rightly distinguishes the past in general from what he calls the past that's not yet history. And in my view, that's the past that's not yet history in which you Ukrainians find yourselves. Hrytsak, again, the mythical worldview inherent in every person manifests itself especially powerfully in times of crisis and upheaval. So if I insist on this point, it's no way a criticism of Ukraine. And it's worth underscoring the fact that before 2014, exercises of the critical history, the kind of critical history that O'Grada and Hrytsak exemplify, were common here. It's not you Ukrainians who insisted on giving the mystical worldview pride of place. It was Vladimir Putin. You've responded with your own counter-myths, not all of which, to be clear, are historically false, even if many are, of course, wildly romanticized, as you all know perfectly well. The folk utopia of a Cossack Ukraine, egalitarian and innocent of either ethnic or social oppression or other forms of class, hatred, etc. I mean, that's not accurate, and everybody here knows that, which doesn't mean you don't need it at the same time. That's the paradox of a time when the past isn't yet past. It's maybe inaccurate, but it's a humanly necessary response. One that, anyway, is really not so much about some Cossack idyll in the 17th century, but more about hopes for Ukraine's future, what Ukraine could look like at its best if you win and if you have the determination to make this country better than it was before the war, which I think most of you do. The good news is you're not being utopian. There's every reason to, and I'm an anti-utopian by kind of, I don't know, it got written on my DNA. So if I say this, it's really because I think it's possible, not just desirable. There's a lot of reason to suppose that Ukraine's future will have greater consensus about Ukraine's past, just as, despite what Russian propagandists say and their useful idiots in the West repeat over and over again, the Ukrainian response to Russia's attempt to extinguish it has been largely liberal nationalist, and thus inclusive, rather than ethnic nationalist and exclusivist, in the sense that historically quite a lot of Ukrainian nationalism has been. It's much more complicated than this, and I'm not for a minute repeating a kind of, Ukrainians were the victimizers of Poles and Jews and have to apologize for everything. It's not at all what I'm saying, but it's a very complicated past, a complicated past but you're, to the extent that even these stereotypes about ethnic nationalism were true, first of all, they were never inevitable, and second, they're changing. You represent the change on a certain level. But even as late as 2014, even as late as the Revolution of Dignity, it wasn't clear. The young, educated people who filled the Maidan had one view of nationalism, but the right sector people who did the fighting, and it's important to remember that without them, Maidan would never have succeeded. They did not have such a liberal cosmopolitan view, or at least a lot of them did not. I think that just reflects how much the 33 years of an independent Ukraine have been a whirlwind of competing visions of Ukraine among Ukrainians. But I think now the die is cast. All you need to do, of course, is to look at the changes in places like Kharkiv, which oppose the language laws so bitterly as recently as a few years ago. And now with the full scale, it's, everyone you meet is speaking Ukrainian. Nobody seems to, at least nobody under 40 I've met, seems to be in opposition to what they were in opposition reasonably recently. So in a sense, the divisions, geographical and others, seem to be waning here. That may not be what Putin intended, but thankfully that's what he got. But again, history is completely unpredictable. There's nothing inevitable. When Yanukovych, Yanukovych was elected, his predecessor didn't seem like he was going to become a Moscow stooge, but he did, and you wouldn't have thought it at the beginning of the previous term. You can't. History is about contingency. It's fundamentally, there are no rules. You don't know how it's going to turn out. Now, I'm aware that there are many Ukrainian patriots, including one of my dearest friends, someone who's become one of my dearest friends, who reject the idea that Ukraine has always been good at national revolution and very bad at national consolidation. But surely there's some truth to it. The debate, if you go back, if you look at papers, academic papers, not just written by foreigners, but written by Ukrainians, about the divisions between, say, 1991 and 2014, you see that many of these arguments have simply disappeared. one of the reasons for that has been the consolidation of the Ukrainian language and the dismissal, in a certain sense, philosophical sense, of the Russian language. But of course, you don't even know now. I was in Kharkiv in the summer of 22, and I ran into some LGBT activists who were very kind and took me on a tour of, if you like, LGBT Kharkiv. And at some point, I asked them about the right sector. And one of them said, well, the right sector, well, before the full scale, they used to attack us and throw rocks through the windows of our bars and all the rest of it. And now, I said, well, now they said we do fundraisers together for the army. But of course, there was an obvious question, which was, what do you think will happen after the war? To which this person, my guide, gave the truthful two-word answer, which is, who knows? And that, again, that's on you, in a sense. That's on the debate about what kind of society Ukraine is, and finally, what kind of society you, the young, who are beginning to take it over, or soon will, want it to be. And of course, you're not all going to agree, but at the same time, you know, the change is obvious, and at least as far as I can see no scenario in which it could be reversed. But again, you know, everything is frozen here. Martial law is a legal concept, but it's also it's a way of thinking about the world. It's a way of being in a world. It's a way of saying some things we cannot deal with now. Now that's not for me to have an opinion about. That's not for a foreigner, even someone who is, you know, considers himself a friend of Ukraine in every possible sense, to have an opinion about. I don't. But there are things you can predict. For example, I can't imagine that the soldiers who are risking their lives so this country can live will return to the kind of, except after the war when they're demobilized, the kind of corruption and nepotism in high places, in business, in many places that this country was, alas, very well known for internationally. I don't believe for a second that they'll go back to that business as usual. Nor do I think, as I was saying just a minute ago, that there'll be a return to Russian that seems to be irreversible as well. And again, these changes, that change among your generation, and I guess even people into their 40s, I don't know whether it applies to anyone older than that or how many people it applies to, but I mean, it's not just changing your language in the way you fill out a form or you do some bureaucratic thing. It's changing, it reaches into the deepest, most intimate parts of your lives. You're changing the language you have your erotic lives in. You're changing the language in which you dream. Those are enormous changes. So for the people who are holding on to Russian, much more than for those of you who come from largely Ukrainian-speaking backgrounds, you know, I wouldn't call it a sacrifice, but it's a transformative experience for people. But again, my sense is, for what it's worth, that there's no returning. And if I can take an example of my own trade, writing, the example of one of your greatest writers, Andrei Kurkov, comes to mind. Now, I consider Kurkov a great writer on the international scene. I'm not, and those who know me know that I don't use words like that very often. But he's also, of course, as you all know, a great Ukrainian patriot. And if he wants to continue to write his novels in Russian, that's absolutely his right. But by the same token, it's difficult for me to imagine somewhere in this university there's the next Andrei Kurkov. And I don't believe that person is going to write their novels in Russian. So what the synthesis about the Ukrainian past will evolve into, I obviously also don't know, but we see signs of things. For example, the the ethnic nationalism of someone like Donsov, seems to be much less important here than various liberal and conservative versions of nationalism. You would say, well, why is that? Why should that be true? After all, there's a long tradition of this kind of hard ethno-nationalism in Ukrainian culture and even philosophical and in political philosophy. But Nietzsche said somewhere that where ideas are concerned, there are no facts, only interpretations. And and look at transformation of the right sector of Azov. They seem to me, many of them would deny that they ever were real ethnic nationalists, but I think even my friends in Azov would admit that at least some of them were. But it seems the less and less central part of the hard right in this country, which again means that there's more likelihood of people basically agreeing about what the next Ukraine should look like. Remember, the national myth of any country in the world, is a work in progress. It always changes. And in this country, no less than other countries, maybe more in some ways, it's changed. For example, was Mazeppa a traitor or a hero? I don't think that question is all that important here anymore. Maybe it is to some people. But I doubt it is. And other things may go that way. Of course, no one in this country is going to forget the Holodomor or in the arts, what you so eloquently call the exterminated Renaissance of the artists who were basically wiped out by Red Power, or the Ukrainians who were in the Bykivnia forest, who were in the common graves, which I'm always surprised here if I can interject something, that so few Ukrainians seem to be interested in that place, or at least as interested as they should be. Everyone goes to Babyn Yar, but frankly, I find the forest at least as important and as a monument, if I can be honest, much more successful morally and aesthetically. But individual heroes, that changes. I mentioned that one of the just wars that I've seen in my life is Bangladesh, their independence. But as some of you, those of you who are interested in world politics will know that there was recently a revolution in Bangladesh which basically overthrew the government led by the party that had fought the War of Independence in 1971. And all the statues were torn down. So, you don't ever know what you're going to think. I don't think that you're going to tear down. I don't expect, and I don't think anyone should ask you to tear down the major patriots from your past, including ones who were very controversial abroad. And you must know, this is probably the part of what I have to say that will displease you, but you have to know that what Bandera or Khmelnytsky represent to Poles or Jews is totally the opposite of what those men represent to you. That's a fact. I'm not arguing the history. I think there are many Ukrainian scholars who would say that, well, Khmelnytsky was at such a different time, and Bandera was maligned. He wasn't really an anti-Semite. I think most of my friends in this country would take that view. But, try convincing a Pole or a Jew, non-Ukrainian Jew, of that, and you'll quickly discover that it's viewed very differently. Obviously, in the case of Khmelnytsky, it would be very difficult to convince the Jewish world because, as you probably know, Khmelnytsky killed more Jews in Europe than anyone between the leaders of the Children's Crusade and Hitler. So in a people as obsessed with memory as the Jewish people are, I don't see how that can be changed. Bandera is a more complicated case, and I don't know that it was more important now than it is. Although, you know, again, your version of Bandera, and I think many people who are otherwise very friendly to you, support you, is very different. And reconciliation, not of views, but if you like, maybe reconciliation of mourning can happen. Look at the, I'm going to mispronounce it, the Lichachev Cemetery in Lviv, which was where the bitterest fighting in the 1918-1919 war took place. This is now a collective site of mourning for both Poles and Ukrainians. And, you know, I don't think that that will change. I don't think anyone wants to rewrite those events or convince either side of the justice of one's own cause. Sometimes mourning is the best way to honor things. Not trying to prove you're right about some historical event. We see that in a bit with you and with Poland, just as we saw it in Ireland after the end of the Troubles in the north of Ireland, where people just decide not to talk about their own cause, whether it was the Republican cause or the cause of those who wanted this part of Ireland to stay as part of Britain. And you don't have to convince anybody. And I don't think that, you know, the Russians make a great show of talking about, you know, Nazis in Kiev, but I think even people who are not profoundly pro-Ukraine find it impossible to believe that a country with a Jewish president is a Nazi country. So, you know, it doesn't convince. And talking about Melnitsky or talking about various versions of what Bandera did or Petliura did, or saying that this black and red OUP flag is a fascist flag, it doesn't work anymore. That battle, I think, you've won. Now, that's not enough, but it's not nothing either. So, in my view anyway, these debates, including about Melnitsky, need to be left for another time. And mind you, you published in this country in 2010, you published the Jewish Chronicle of Melnitsky's massacres, the chronicles of a man called Nathan of Hanover. It's published here. And Alexander Zaitsev at the Catholic University in Lviv has written a lot about Bandera in a very complicated, subtle way, taking neither really looking at him in that more academic, historical way of depoliticizing, or at least taking the heat out of considering it. And I think, you know, that work is going on, that he can do that work while, you know, at the same time there are units of the armed forces of Ukraine named after both of these figures, is admirable. It's another proof of your intellectual vitality, I think, or openness. I want to also, you know, just touch on what I think of as the cultural martial law regarding Russian and Russian culture. And I don't want to, again, I'm a foreigner, and while I know something about this country by now, I think I very much hesitate to venture an opinion about the rights and wrongs of the language law, for example. But you know, Putin's denial that Ukraine exists except as part of the Russian world, which is to say his decision to wage a war not just against your bodies but against your language and culture, would seem to ratify the language laws to me. You know, he might, you know, it might be different, but this is a war this is a war against your bodies, but it's also a war against your language, against your culture. It's really a war against your imagination in a deep way. I think that's the best way to explain this war, at least to foreigners. You probably don't need to explain it to themselves, but it's certainly the way I think that Ukraine's fundamentally defensive culture war against Russia needs to be understood. The battlefield, any battlefield, is about fighting for your existential survival. And here in this war, culture is a battlefield. And, there are people, I have to tell you, in the West who don't agree. There's in the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, where I'm based, and which has been very generous to Ukrainian artists. There have been people from the operas of both Kyiv and Lviv who've worked there. They're Ukrainian conductors, et cetera, there. So this is an institution whose institutional policy is very pro-Ukrainian. But there's a button or some kind of magnet in the kitchen magnet, whatever it is, in the gift shop where you walk past when you go to the opera in New York, that says, "Cancel Putin, not Pushkin." And many people find this perfectly reasonable, and you are very criticized for this abroad. Now, I came here with those criticisms in my head and no longer abide by them. That is to say, I'm more with you now. But that's not because, as some people here say, that I don't think Russian literature is just as great as people say it is. I don't think that's Russian propaganda. I think that's literary and artistic fact. So, if you say nothing is lost by no longer reading Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, etc., I think that's wishful thinking. And if I can go a bit further in this, calling Hohol or Chekhov exclusively Ukrainian writers, you have to ignore a whole lot of their work, and indeed some of the projects that they were engaged in, not just because of the Russian language. That's not the problem. And I think it's Andrei Kurkov who said that one proof that Hohol is a Ukrainian writer is he finally injects humor into Russian literature, which is, I suspect is true. But the problem is that there is this thing called Russian imperial writing, where nationality is only one part of the story, so that Hohol's Dead Souls is the great dystopian novel of the Russian Empire. And Chekhov is the great chronicler of that empire's high bourgeoisie's anguish, mental anguish, private anguish. The separatist literary theory, I suspect, will not work, or art theory. There's the same problem with the painter Repin, et cetera, which I don't need to go into. But, and the problem is also, as many of your best historians have pointed out, it's in no way original with me, that Ukraine is not just Ireland, a pure colony. It's Scotland in relation both to Britain, in the sense that the Scots were conquered and were colonized, but then many Scots became the administrators of the British Empire, just as Ukrainians have played outsized roles historically in the administration both of Imperial Russia and of the post-Stalin USSR. So those are the doubts, and it's better that you hear them. I came here thinking, when I was given this honor, told that I was going to receive this honor, I thought, how truthful am I going to be? But I really don't want to be one of these foreigners who just comes here and says how wonderful you are and how right you are about everything. You are wonderful, but of course you're not completely right about everything. Who is? But I myself have come to the position, which isn't, I think, very different from position intellectuals and artists most take here, which is that the fact that there's this cultural martial law, that booksellers won't stock Russian books, that even friends of mine have gotten rid of their collections of Russian literature. And, as far as I'm concerned, that's really okay. And anyway, as people, coming back to that button that makes such a stir horrifies Ukrainians when they come to New York, or anyway, saddens them, let's say. The problem is that if there were Pushkin statues in every city in Ukraine, it wasn't because the Politburo loved literature. It was an assertion of the superiority of Russian culture. That's what it was about, and you were not only within your rights, it would have been pure masochism on your part not to tear them down. And remember, even this city, you're all too young, but friends of mine who lived here 20 years ago say that in, high bourgeois Ukraine, Kiev, speaking Ukrainian was frowned upon. So, the internal, the internal censor is often a more effective censor than the public one. I think giving up these writers is a loss, but I also think on balance you're correct in doing so, because again, it's not just cultural piety. This culture war is not your cultural impiety against everyone else's cultural piety. It's much more complicated than that. Because to put it away, and I'm coming to the end of this talk, there's a moral ecology of cultural life as well as a hierarchy of quality. And right now that moral ecology deserves to come first. And in any case, there is no, if you think about it, there's no categorical imperative for a cultivated Ukrainian to say they have to read Russian literature, any more than there were for cultivated Jews for the first quarter century after the Second World War, after the Shoah, to listen to Wagner, Hitler's favorite composer. They weren't obliged, and you're not obliged. Even though Wagner was indeed one of the greatest composers in the history of classical music. There's simply, that's also a fact. But, it was Putin who weaponized Russian culture, his choice, not yours. So cultural piety be damned in that sense. You've every right, and some of you may well feel now that you have a duty to reject Russian culture since it's deployed mainly to destroy your own culture. And there is a positive side, which is that the banishing of Russian culture has been the rediscovery and long overdue injection into the bloodstream of your cultural life, the great works of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian literature, the Ukrainian language, that was suppressed under both the empire and the Soviet Union. So, you're fighting a war for your existential survival, but the paradox is that probably for the first time in your history, your culture and your language can breathe, which seems to me a great triumph. So I've gone on way too long, and I've got to stop. So look, my crystal ball broke a long time ago, but let me say a couple of words about the future. You Ukrainians, you want victory and justice, and in a better world, you'd get both. But if this war has proven anything, it's that the world is what the German philosopher Hegel said it was more than 2 centuries ago, which is it's a slaughterhouse. So I don't just pray you achieve victory. I think your victory is achievable. But I don't believe you're going to get justice in the sense of seeing Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov, the rest of them, in The Hague and judged by the court. I don't, because that would require the liberalization of Russia. And on Russia, I'm a pessimist. And I don't think that will happen in your lifetimes, let alone in whatever time remains to me. But then again, if I could, I do want to end on an optimistic note. I mean this. There was a famous remark of Stalin, of all people, who said that about the Soviet way of war. He said quantity was its own form of quality. And what I want to suggest is that for you, victory will be its own form of justice. So I thank НаУКМА for the great honor it bestows on me. I thank all of you for your attention. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава! Thank you, David. So, we have some time for questions and answers.
At this point, I would just like to express my immense gratitude to you for you giving this performance to all of us. I would like to I would like to let you know that you're an amazing person, and that your speech meant a lot to all of us. On behalf of all first-year students, thank you for this support, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Guys, we have about 10 minutes, just question by question, please.
Greetings, so I won't take any long. Given that you know more of Western mentality and understanding of what's going on there in the politics and the media, if in the worst cases of all and Ukraine fails, Ukraine falls, just like, how will it be treated? Will the Europe, will the USA, which is on the other end of the earth, understand that it's pretty much similar like it was to Ukraine as the fall of the Donetsk, of the Crimea, etc. And given that Putin's appetite won't be sated, and it most likely won't, what will happen if they go both on, first of all, NATO's territory, and the second, Kazakhstan? Because not many know, but the Kazakhstanians are being really ideologically treated as much as the people of Donbass now, but not many talk about it. Thank you.
It's a very good question. I think Putin wants to restore the Russian Empire, and that certainly includes Kazakhstan. It includes Ukraine, but it also includes Kazakhstan. And I think he wants the Baltics back. So my own view is, that the people here who say Europe, it's absolutely vital for Europe that it stop, that you defeat with help the Russians is, in my view, correct. We've all been very frustrated, those of us who support Ukraine, by the slowness, by the disagreements in the West. It will be much better if Harris is elected than Trump, for you, probably for us too, but that's another conversation. And it's important what happens in these German elections. I mean, the problem is that a lot of people got very used to seeing Russia as a fundamentally benign place in Europe, I mean, and it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for such an important election. And so you said that we probably surprised even ourselves in that heroic resistance. But my question is, how do you think, does the rest of the world fully understands the importance of our victory? And do they see our true strengths? And are they ready to support it until the end? Or the world is still just standing at the point of uncertainty, in your opinion?
It's a very good question. Of course, it's a question that's on everybody's mind here. Look, I think the best thing you could do is stop talking about the world and start talking about the NATO countries. Because to be honest with you, if you say the future of world democracy depends on Ukraine to an Indian, that Indian is going to say, don't be silly. There are more people in India than in, half of India is more people than Europe, North America, and Russia, I think, or anyway, 2/3 or something like that, So the point is that all the cases you make for the centrality of Ukraine apply when they're focused on Europe. When they get diffused, and it's like everybody in Latin America has to think about Ukraine and everyone in Africa or everyone in India or something, I don't think that's useful to you, and I don't think you're going to convince them. The work needs to be done in Brussels, in Washington, in Berlin, in London, etc.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for being here. And because of lack of the time, straight to the question. What do you think about the Budapest Memorandum, and was it a critical mistake of our government?
Look, I wasn't there. In retrospect, it seems like a mistake, but you don't know what was going on behind the scenes. It feels like a mistake, and certainly viewed with hindsight, it's a mistake. But that's the problem with history. You don't have the distance. That's what I meant with that Kierkegaard quote that I started out with. Of course, it's been immensely damaging to you. There's no doubt about it.
And
Actually, Russians are using our missiles and our military aircraft against us, according to Budapest Memorandum. But it's a history, yeah.
And second question, brief one.
It's not second question, but only for you, second question, because a lot of people, please.
Yeah. A little bit of topic. What do you think about the Rhodesia?
What?
About the Rhodesia. Yeah.
Rhodesian?
Rhodesia.
There hasn't been a Rhodesia in 50 years.
Yeah.
Rhodesia doesn't exist.
Yeah, I know. And
But
I'm
what did I
asking you,
think
what
about
do
it
you-
at the time?
Yeah.
I think white minority rule is not a good thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I would ask you about the Russian culture, because you say that we shouldn't ban Russian authors and Russian composers, but also you tell about the national myth. Anastasia Levkova in one of her books writes that there should die Гильний, Хвильовий, and so on, to Bulgarov to be. So the Russian nation based on a lot of dies of Ukrainian national myth. Is it okay for you?
Well, first of all, I don't have any problem with you banning things at the moment. If you understood me to be saying that, if people don't want to sell, if booksellers in this country, as I'm informed, they won't stock Russian books, I think that's their right. I have no problem with that. And if you don't want to read Brodsky because of that vile poem he wrote about Ukraine, why would you want to? But if you're going to say to me that it's not a loss to lose 4 or 5 of the greatest writers in the history of literature, what are the 19th century writers I'm talking about here, I'm not talking about 20th century writers, that's a loss. What I also said, though, was I think at this moment, it's a loss that's worth it. That you're not wrong to say this is the way we want it right now. Whether you always have that view, I don't know.
You can have your own thought, okay? Yeah. Because we have freedom of speech and we have academic discussion.
Yeah.
That is why. Yeah. Thank you very much.
A lot of Western politicians still about modern axis of evil. Russia, China, People's Republic, Iran. My question is, how dangerous this axis to Western world and Ukraine? Because Russian invasion to Ukraine in February 22 is invasion of this axis to Western world. And how Western politicians understand these dangers?
Well, that's more complicated than it may in the broader sense, maybe than it looks in the way. It may be more complicated internationally, globally, than it is about you. Obviously, you don't the effect of these alliances, above all between Russia and China, but to a secondary extent, you quite right, Iran, is tremendously helpful for weapons for these countries, particularly China, because it's one thing to, China is so involved in global trade that embargoes on China are very unlikely to work. I think, I don't think these alliances are stable, first of all. And I think that the Chinese, China's only interested in China. Right now it suits them to be with the Russians. If they think it doesn't fit their interests anymore, they'll abandon the Russians like that. So you have to look at each of these countries. Iran is a country in total crisis. The economy has collapsed. The women, incredibly bravely, are resisting the mullahs. The trade unions are striking everywhere. It's a very unstable regime. Whether it will collapse in time to help you, I don't know.
And this is diploma of honorary professor by the decision of Academic Council of Kyiv-Mogil Academy.
Thank you. I'm really honored.